Hello everyone, Treasure here again on our 3D animation course in Blender. In this second lesson, we are going to be understanding the fundamental concept of 3D. What exactly is 3D? So be sure to grab your coffee, grab your pens and your paper, and let's get started. Now today's video will be focused on explaining the fundamental concept of 3D. Specifically, what does 3D mean exactly? We've heard this word being thrown around a lot, but what exactly does it mean?
What do you mean? What do you mean?
So the D in 3D means dimensions. So 3D simply means 3 dimensions. 2D means 2 dimensions. However, the word dimensions might feel too complex or too bogus or too bloated. So I think it's easier once you replace the word dimensions with directions. So when we say 3 dimensions or 3D, we are referring to a space that has 3 directions. And when we say 2D, we are referring to a space that has 2 directions. Now, this still does not make sense. However, in order for us to fully understand this, we're going to have to go back to everybody's least favorite subject in secondary school, which was mathematics, specifically graphs. Graphs are the foundation of 2D and 3D. So what you are seeing here is a 2D graph. Why is it called a 2D graph? Because it has 2 directions. What are the 2 directions? The Y direction or Y axis that goes up and down, and the X direction or X axis going left and right. This is a 2D graph, and these are the directions that an object can move into the space. So if we take a 2D object like a square and you bring it into this space, you can see it can only move along these 2 directions, which is up and down, left and right. Some of you might think, what about diagonal? But diagonal is simply this object moving on the X and the Y axis simultaneously at the same time. So it's still moving up and down the Y axis, left and right on the X axis, or both of them, the X axis and the Y axis simultaneously. So when we say an object is in 2D space, we mean that object can only move in 2 directions, which is the Y direction and the X direction. However, while this object can move left and right, up and down, it cannot move forward and backwards. It cannot move towards me or away from me. So that is the limitation of 2D. The objects can't move towards us or away from us. This is where the 3rd dimension comes into place, which is the Z-axis. And this is what we refer to as 3D space. The object can now move on the X direction, left and right, the Y direction, up and down, and the Z direction, which is forward and backward. So an object that can move in all these 3 directions is referred to as a 3D object in a 3D space. So a 3D space refers to a space that has 3 directions of movement. This is a massive oversimplification of the process. However, if you can simply just remember that 2D means just 2 directions, which is the X and the Y axis, then an object can only move in 2 directions. And 3D means an object can move in 3 directions, the X, the Y, and the Z axis. You know more than 90% of the population, and that is the foundation towards understanding 3D, because this is going to come into play once we enter into Blender. So a quick recap on the difference between 2D and 3D. A 2D space has only 2 directions or dimensions, which is the X direction and the Y direction. Meanwhile, in 3D space, we have 3 directions or dimensions, which is the X direction, the Y direction, and the Z direction. In 2D space, an object can only move left and right, or up and down, or in between, which is the diagonal. It's moving upwards and sideways. it's still just moving on the x-axis and the y-axis. It can't move towards us or away from us. But in 3D space, an object can move left, right, up, down, diagonally, and it can move forward and backwards towards us and away from us. That is what differentiates an object in 2D space and an object in 3D space.
So that's all for our deep dive on the concept of 3D. What exactly is 3D? In our next lesson, we're going to be going into our 3D software of choice called Blender. Specifically, how can you install Blender on your system? So be sure to check that out.
Enjoy all these premium courses in this channel for free.